Hello, everybody. In the first Trump administration, there was all sorts of publicity of the antics that his two sons got up to in Africa with dead animals, lots of photos of them enjoying the fruits of hunting down these big game. A lot of people were shocked. On the appropriately named, perhaps, Daily Beast, there is a piece about Donald Trump's sons killing exotic animals. Of course, it's hard to be Trump's son. He's such a remarkable fellow in both, depending how you look at it, both perhaps a good and a bad way. And it's true of many other politicians, American politicians too. He's sometimes actually compared with Teddy Roosevelt, the great early 20th century American president, a man who avoided cliches and categories. And we're talking not just about Teddy Roosevelt today, but about his sons and their antics in another big game adventure. My guest today is Nathalia Holt, the author of a new book called The Beast in the Clouds, The Roosevelt Brothers' Deadly Quest to Find the Mythical Giant Panda. It's a book about Teddy Roosevelt's two sons, and Nat is joining us from her home just outside Monterey. I don't want to turn this, Nat, into one more conversation about Trump, but I'm guessing, I'm not sure if you saw these photos of the Trump boys in front of dead animals from 10 years ago, but I'm guessing your heart might have gone out to them in the sense that they're victims as the sons of a famous man, although I'm guessing our heart also goes out to the dead animals they killed.
My heart definitely goes out to the animals, and the book I write is very much focused on conservation and the preservation of species. And in fact, the story that I'm telling is all about the birth of conservation biology and how scientists changed their minds, how they went from believing that endangered animals needed to be hunted and killed to be studied to instead be described and to be photographed and to be given far more protections. And so it's certainly an interesting comparison to look at Trump's sons and their African safari and the Roosevelts. But of course, the times couldn't be more different. And Roosevelt himself was very progressive at the time. He's certainly a man that was known for his conservation of land, of animals. And this is in line of the time. The thinking at the time was that hunting was a natural part of this, and that in order to discover new species, you had to take these kind of expeditions. And it's a little hard for us to imagine at the time, but the panda was this animal that was mythical. Many people did not believe it even existed in the Western world. And so when the Roosevelt sons go out to discover the panda, what they find is very different than what they expected. Many people believed that the panda would be a cross between a polar bear and a black bear, a very aggressive, dangerous animal.
Let's get into the details. You've mentioned Teddy Roosevelt. We've done a number of shows on him and his love affair with nature. I'm not sure it was always entirely reciprocated, but I think in overall terms, of course, he did a lot more good for the environment than he did bad. Did he, as a father, was he what one would expect of a charismatic American president, a particularly dynamic one, perhaps the most dynamic in history? What kind of father was he?
Teddy Roosevelt was an incredibly affectionate father who would get down on the floor and play with his kids. He wrote his kids long letters when he was traveling. He drew them pictures. He was incredibly sweet with them. He told them many times how much he loved them. It's certainly not our picture of a president from this time, or even fathers in general from that time period. But on the other hand, he could also be very hard on his sons. He would tell his son, Kermit Roosevelt, that he was afraid he would end up as a weakling. He wanted him to be tough. He pushed his eldest son, Ted, to go into politics. He really wanted him to be successful as he was in politics. And you can imagine that for the sons of this very famous man, this was not easy. You know, we think of them as sort of having everything handed to them, which of course they did have so many advantages in this world. But growing up with these expectations was a lot, and it could be hard on them as well.
Remind us, Nat, of Teddy Roosevelt's own rather tragic personal history, the death of how many wives died on him? Certainly one.
Yes, his first wife died on him as well as his child. And this was an incredibly traumatic moment, of course. It's what led him to take one of his early expeditions. In fact, it's interesting because what we see with Teddy Roosevelt is that after immensely difficult personal moments, he would often go on an expedition. So we see that happened after the death of his first wife, as well as after he was defeated in 1912 when he was running for president again. And in that time, he went to Brazil and began exploring the River of Doubt with his son, Kermit Roosevelt, which was just an incredibly perilous and dangerous journey that brought him to the brink of death. He lost much of his body weight. He really suffered during that trip. And so you can almost see that this book, where you have his eldest sons going on this expedition, they're also leaving at a time that is very difficult in their personal lives. Ted, the eldest son, has just been what his wife called politically obliterated. As part of his job as assistant secretary for the Navy, he had been involved in this bribery scandal called the Teapot Dome scandal. And although ultimately he was
And
cleared
it was a
of,
pretty serious scandal. I mean, it defined the 1920s, perhaps reflected it was certainly more of a scandal than Watergate. So it was pretty bad.
absolutely. Yes. And after that, he knew that he had no future in politics, that he would never become the senator or the president that he might have dreamed of and follow in his father's footsteps. And instead, he watches as his cousin FDR begins to rise politically. And then at the same time, you have Kermit Roosevelt, who has struggled. He does not have a successful business. He suffers from alcoholism. He's having difficulties with his families. And so both the sons at this point in their lives, they are 41 and 39 years old. They're in a way running away from life. They do want to get out in the woods. They want to find the panda. But as they say in all of their journals and all of their letters, they didn't really expect that they would be able to do it because at this point in time, in 1928, when the expedition begins, scientists had been searching for the panda for 60 years. You had decades of expeditions going out to try to find what is the last large mammal unknown to science. And they're all failing. Nobody expects that the Roosevelts, who are certainly not scientists and who are traveling with a very small team of naturalists and explorers, would be the ones to be successful.
I want to get to the expedition in a second, but before we get there, Kermit, not Kermit, Teddy Roosevelt, of course, wasn't just an adventurer, a nature lover of the American environment, but he was also an imperialist involved in all sorts of overseas wars, personally and politically, Cuba, Philippines. Was his attitude, in a sense, towards nature different from his attitude towards conquering other places in the name of America?
That's an interesting question because certainly his attitude towards nature is very much protective. There's many beautiful quotes that you see from Teddy Roosevelt where he talks about how advertisements are vandalism. He talks about pollution, very ahead of his time, and thinking about pollution and the effects of commercialization on nature. And certainly the same can't be said for his attitude in other world events and in the wars that he was part of.
So nature was something, in a sense, to be conquered, but in perhaps a gentle sense, perhaps in an odd way, like his sons.
Yes, and I think that's what's so interesting about this story is because we see them starting out the expedition very much hunters, very much looking to conquer a species. And they emerge as something quite different. And to me, that was very interesting to look at how that happened, to look at their journals and their letters and all of the regrets that end up happening from the unintended consequences of this expedition.
You've written a number of books, Nat. Rise of the Rocket Girls, The Queens of Animation, Wise Girls, mostly focusing on women in history and in science. Why did you choose this one?
This wasn't an easy book to get published. I think many people expected I would keep writing about women in history, which I love to do. But this story really spoke to me. I felt like it was an important story to tell because it hasn't been written about before. There hasn't been an account of this expedition since the Roosevelts themselves published a book in 1929. And there's so much to say about what kind of impact the expedition had on conservation, on the panda. And it just gives us a very different view of how we look at endangered species today. And also how people can change their minds, how they become transformed by travel, by peoples that they're not expecting to meet, by cultures that they don't expect to be part of. And it was fascinating to be able to look at that. I love writing about people in history that haven't gotten their due. And in this book, I don't only write about the Roosevelts, I also include many other people on the expedition. And that is Tai Jack Young, who was a 19-year-old NYU student born in Hawaii. His father was from San Francisco, his mother from China, and he joins the expedition. With such interesting perspective of what it was like to be with the Roosevelts. I was fortunate to get his unpublished autobiography, as well as some interviews he had done with a journalist named Michael Kiefer in the 1990s. And it just gives this full perspective on what it's like on this expedition. And I also included some perspectives from other members of the trail. So I talk about not only the men, but also the women that were part of this expedition. You have a large group of women who served as guides, kind of like Sherpas on the trip. And what they saw, what they experienced is just incredible.
Coming back to Teddy, who, like in every other aspect of his life, seems to shadow this narrative. He was, of course, dead by then. Do you think if he'd been around, he would have insisted on going with his boys?
It's an interesting question. After the River of Doubt expedition in Brazil with Kermit Roosevelt, he never went on another expedition again. And I think that trip really changed him. It's hard for me to imagine him journeying to China, even if he had been very healthy after he saw what he saw in Brazil. And it's interesting because I feel like it's a very similar experience for his two eldest sons on this trip. After this expedition, they're also done. They do not go on expeditions that are hunting trips following this. And really, the difference they make in their lives becomes evident just by their actions and what they do afterwards.
Why, Nat, was the panda this mythical animal? I mean, we're not talking about, and I hope I won't get into trouble here, we're not talking about a trip into deepest Africa. I mean, we're talking about China, which was certainly better known than Africa in the early part of the 20th century. It was no heart of darkness narrative. Why were pandas so mythical? Didn't the Chinese know about them?
You would think so, but actually China is a massive country and with many autonomous regions at that time. And so although you would think there would be lots of travel across China, that's not the case. Very few scientific expeditions had gone to the region between Tibet and China because it was almost impossible to travel to. There were no roads.
Locals, though, I mean, didn't they know of the existence of the panda?
This is a very rare animal even today. It is one of the rarest mammals that exist. And in the book, I talk about how even scientists studying the panda today have a very difficult time finding them. And so unless you knew exactly what you were looking for, it would be difficult for an outsider, even from a neighboring area, to find that bear. And so for the people that did live near the panda, and I talk about this in the book, they were called the Yi people, and they were autonomous from China. They were very isolated. They didn't mix with many of the other cultures in China at that time. And they had a lot of respect for the panda. This was not an animal they hunted, so there were not furs being traded between groups. And so you can see why it took so long to be able to describe this animal, unlike polar bears, black bears, grizzly bears, which had been known for centuries. People knew about these bears, but the panda, they did not. They had no firm proof for Western scientists that this animal existed.
So is the panda, in a sense, a kind of, I mean, I guess all species are in their own ways evolutionary miracles, including ourselves. But is the panda particularly miraculous in an evolutionary sense?
The panda is evolutionarily linked with its habitat. It relies on bamboo. It has developed over the centuries to only eat bamboo. It has a thumb that's perfect for grasping bamboo. There's really not another animal like it that depends so highly on bamboo. And so it's interesting in this book because we see the Roosevelts go through all these different regions. They go through the Himalayas, they go through the Tibetan Plateau. They're searching for the panda. And when they finally find it, of course, it's this dense bamboo jungle. It seems so obvious to us today, but that's how little was known about the panda's habitat.
What about at that time? I know it's not a political book, but the politics of China. Of course, this was pre-Mao. This was pre-Chiang Kai-shek, wasn't it?
That's right. So this is all happening during a civil war in China where you have the nationalist army that is spreading out and taking over all of these regions of China, taking power. And I discuss in the book what that looked like in many of these villages in Western China, and in many areas that had very separate, isolated cultures. And we see in the book, there's this one very poignant moment where Jack describes going into a town and seeing 3 teenagers that are executed by the nationalist army because they're speaking out against taxes and speaking out for free speech in the region. And the Roosevelts, of course, weren't prepared for this. They really didn't realize what they were getting into. And so we see the effects of this civil war all along their journey.
It must have been an enormously expensive and obviously intricate expedition. Whose idea was it in the first place? What's the genealogy of the trip? Was it Teddy or Theodore Jr. or Kermit who came up with the idea, or was it someone else?
It's Ted that really wanted to do this trip, and Kermit was right along there with him. They weren't able to get funding from the American Museum of Natural History in New York. Instead, they had to get funding from the Field Museum in Chicago. And there was a wealthy philanthropist there who funded the trip. And in the book, I talk about how in this era, in the 1920s, in some ways it's similar to today. You had this wealth concentrated in the 1% of the population. And you have all of these philanthropists that are trying to fund these expeditions so that they can have museum exhibits with their name on it. And that is really how this funding comes together. The Roosevelts themselves, although you would think they might have all of this money, I kind of detail how that inheritance happened and why they don't have enough to fund this trip on their own.
But presumably they worked the old Teddy network. I mean, he
absolutely. Yes, absolutely.
And as you note, their cousin, he wasn't president yet, but he was also well connected, and the entire Roosevelt clan was remarkably powerful.
Just having the name Roosevelt would open doors that wouldn't be closed to many others. So certainly the only reason they're being funded on this trip is because of their name and their connection to their famous father.
And of course, they didn't just jump on an airplane and fly off to China. This must have involved not just a huge amount of financing, but massive planning. What did they do? Go by ship to China?
They did. So they went first to Europe and they kind of went around that way. They ended up going through India and walking across the border into China.
That in itself was an adventure.
It really was. Actually, that's a whole part of the book that I ended up cutting. It's fascinating to me to look at all the planning. It was
maybe your next book
together.
Do that one.
It is. It's almost a book in itself.
And of course, 1929 was also the year of the Great Crash, which must have added to the challenges of financing and organizing this trip.
So the crash happened after the expedition. So they leave in December of 1928. They come back in June of 1929. And so you can imagine how the world is about to change as they come back.
Yeah, they didn't have the internet back then. They couldn't call home and figure out. So I guess when they showed up back somewhere, they must have been rather surprised. How long did the trip? So it took what, about a year, the whole trip?
A little under a year. That's right.
And can we? I mean, I know that the narrative involves lots of characters, but the two central ones are Theodore Roosevelt Jr. and Kermit. In terms of the story, what is most memorable about these two men's involvement? I mean, they were both troubled individuals. Kermit ended up committing suicide. As you know, Teddy Jr. was a political failure already. Was this their opportunity, in a sense, to wipe the slate clean?
I believe so. They are coming into this expedition at a very low point in their lives where they've had many failures, both professionally and personally. And this trip is really a way to turn that around. Many times, Kermit writes about how it's only in the wilds where men show who they really are. And they talk about how they're really only comfortable when they're together. They have this ease in the wilderness thanks to their father that they don't necessarily have in their regular lives. And so it's interesting for me in this book because what we see is that so many of their preconceived notions of what the panda is going to be like, of how this expedition is going to go, are completely wrong. And what they find is so different. And it changes them. It changes fundamentally who they are. And when they come back after this trip, they immediately regret their actions with the panda. They immediately see that this is not some aggressive beast. And unfortunately, what happens next is that all of these big game hunters and these zoos now know where the panda is located and begin to send people to get them.
Boys of the 1930s, anyway.
Exactly. Yes, and the Roosevelts are devastated by this because they know that they are the ones that have caused this, and they say very explicitly in their letters how upset they are and how this wasn't what they intended. They have this one meeting at a hotel in New York where they're with Ruth Harkness, who's this socialite who has gone to get the first panda cub from China. That's a good story in itself, of which books have been written about. And she got there using the Roosevelt's maps. And so she meets with them in this hotel. And someone jokingly says, oh, maybe one day this cub will be stuffed alongside your pandas in the Field Museum. And Ted is very angry and he says, I'd sooner stuff my own son. Their feelings about what's happened have really changed. And actually, Ruth Harkness ends up changing her mind and ends up having very big regrets about her actions as well.
Should we really, though, be sorry, Nat, for the Roosevelt boys? Harkness, another socialist, of course, funded the Harkness Scholarship. What about the Chinese? I mean, let alone the pandas, of course, the ultimate victims of all this and can't speak for themselves. But weren't Chinese nationalists, and there was a strong degree of Chinese nationalism, as you note, involved in a civil war against the left, weren't they outraged that these couple of fairly clueless sons of a dead American president show up in their country and start trying to discover their own indigenous mythical beast?
You might think so. It's an understandable expectation, but that wasn't the case at all because the panda was so little known that their first reaction was to hire some of the members of the expedition, including Tai Jack Young, to go hunt a panda for themselves, for their own museums, because they didn't have any. That was the first thinking. And it's really not until later on when you have all of these big game hunters, when you have people stealing cubs from China for the zoo in New York and in Chicago, that then there's this real change of thinking. And it's impressive that Kermit Roosevelt plays a large role in this. He becomes the president of the Audubon Society, as well as has a role on the New York Zoological Society. And as part of this, he begins working with Chinese diplomats and with many people that he knows there to gain protections for the panda. And the panda is really the first animal to gain these protections. It's a real turning point because you've had many endangered animals previously that they go extinct and nobody makes any laws. There's nothing that's changed. But the pandas, because they know how rare they are, they decide to change things. And it's an important moment. It's an important turning point. It really changes how scientists behave and how policies can impact species.
Is one of the reasons we have such a softness for or an affection for pandas because they're so cute. They always seem cute, although I'm sure if you had to have one in your home, they wouldn't be quite as cute as they sometimes appear.
Probably not a good idea to have one in your home in general. But pandas certainly.
Pet, right?
No, you would not want a wild animal as a pet. Certainly not. But they are gentle creatures. These are not bears that have ever been known for attacking or humans or killing humans, unlike, of course, other bear species.
Do they fight with each other? Are they territorial?
They're, they are territorial, but they live very isolated lives. And so much of their communication is not face to face. It is actually through how they rub glands on trees to tell each other territory and to communicate. So there's not fighting between individuals in the way that we think of other animals doing that kind of territorial behavior.
Yeah, as you say, they're sort of an evolutionary miracle. What kind of numbers existed before the Roosevelt brothers showed up, when no one knew about these pandas? How many were there approximately? And they were just limited to a fairly isolated part of Western China. Is that right?
That's right. Yeah, they're really known to be in a few isolated bamboo forests that are spread throughout China. And it's hard to say exactly what numbers existed before the Roosevelts found them. We don't have a lot of scientific surveys, so hard to
Well, you've done
guess.
the research. I mean, are we talking about thousands, hundreds, tens?
We're
of
talking about 2,000 would be the rough
Oh my
estimate.
God, 2,000.
Mm-hmm.
And these creatures existed for centuries. Does any evolutionary scientist now trace back their origins? When did they begin? I mean, only 2,000. So they're already profoundly endangered even before Kermit and Theodore Jr. showed up.
Exactly. These were always very rare mammals. They were never large numbers throughout China, at least not in any history that we know of. There certainly is no record of that. So while scientists have been able to look at the evolutionary changes that the panda has made to adapt to its environment, and continue to look at that, there's a lot of look at how their coats may have cryptic advantages, even though we think black and white doesn't seem as if it should give any advantage in terms of camouflage. Scientists are showing that actually that's not true, that it can help camouflage with shadows and light in these bamboo forests. And so there's a lot of work looking at the panda today because, of course, it is one of those species that people are most eager to save and to protect. And with those protections, what we're seeing is there are also protections for the other species that the panda lives with. And so in the book, I talk about this low period that occurred in the 80s and 90s, where you have deforestation in China. You don't have the protections for many of the reserves that we have today, and how things have shifted. And now that you have this protection of the panda that's been expanded, and it has helped. It's kind of served as this umbrella species that helps other animals that live in these bamboo forests as well.
Have we seen the emergence of what you might call panda politics? I know in terms of zoos and relations between the US and China, the pandas have played an important role. What accounts for that? When was the first panda brought to a US zoo?
So if the first panda was brought by Ruth Harkness in 1938, and she just stuffed it in her purse and snuck it. She paid a tax for it being a dog. And for a while, that's how all the cubs were brought. And unfortunately, none of them lived very
Illegally,
long.
then. When you say stuffed in her purse, she didn't declare it at customs, presumably.
No, absolutely not. And that's how many of these early cubs, all of them, were brought to the United States at first. And they all have a pretty tragic story because zookeepers did not have the knowledge to know how to take care of them. So even though they spent a lot of money to bring these cubs to the zoo, most of them didn't live more than a few years. And what we see is that by the 1950s, they were all gone. There were no more pandas in zoos in the United States. And it's Nixon, of course, in the 1970s that changes that and ushers in this era of panda politics that we see today.
Irony of ironies, Richard Nixon and pandas, you wouldn't necessarily associate the two of them, would you?
You would not. But of course, the strides he made in creating this diplomacy and this connection with China is something that has been very lasting for the United States.
And has the panda become a more sort of symbolic animal for the Chinese as China has become a world power, a stronger power, able to stand up to the West and the United States? Does the panda have a particular place in its, I don't know, natural pantheon, or are most Chinese still relatively indifferent to pandas?
Oh no, the panda has really earned its place as a beloved symbol of China. Certainly, it's a symbol of conservation as well. But it's one of those animals that you couldn't have predicted at the time when men were going out and hunting this animal that would end up becoming so important to the country and so important to conservation in general.
Why were they hunting them? Would they eat them, or they just enjoyed their coats?
This is, you know, it's hard for us to imagine what it was like at this time, but scientists would often kill animals in order to study them. It was really the only way that was seen as a viable solution to understand a species. Photographs were not great at being able to capture what an animal really looked like, and scientists had to study the length of bones, had to look at so many different parts of their feet and teeth to see how they fit in with other species of the kind and to categorize what the animal was. So before the Roosevelts went on their expedition, all scientists had were pelts. All they had was a black and white coat, essentially. And so then to have the actual bones and to have information about where the animal lived, what it ate, all of this was important to recognize it as a species. And really, at the time, there was even a thinking that endangered animals needed to be hunted. It was not uncommon to do that. And the thinking was that these species were doomed. Nature had made its choice. And so scientists had to take in these animals and understand as much about them as they could while they were still on Earth. The panda expedition really changed this kind of thinking, and it's so much because of the love of pandas that happened after the Roosevelts brought the animals back to the U.S.
Yeah, it's real history. It's not mythological history. I hope you sold the movie rights. It sounds like a wonderful movie, and of course, it didn't end well. There was no Hollywood ending for the two boys, was there? They both had very sad lives. Certainly after the expedition, you note that it was the high point of both their lives. They actually finally achieved something, but afterwards, both of their lives went downhill. Is that fair?
It is. They both really suffered in the years after. We do see some moments of redemption for them. So Kermit Roosevelt, for example, fought for rights for pandas. He also ended up going on expeditions for endangered animals where he did not hunt them, did not bring them back for zoos, but went instead to the Galapagos and studied tortoises. And they made a plan to help breeding of the species there and to help protect the species there. He worked on many other projects like that. He seemed to really change the entire focus of his life after this expedition. And Ted as well had some real moments where you can see change. He, of course, wasn't able to return to politics in the way that he had before. And he ended up becoming an editor at a publishing company and kind of settling down in New York. And so while the ending of their lives is very sad, occurring during World War II, and Kermit, as you said, does take his own life, there are some lovely moments for them near the end as well.
Ted was also the Governor General of the Philippines, so unusual as an American was a colonial governor. Yeah, I take your point. Obviously, they had sad lives, and we shouldn't celebrate that. But these were entitled aristocrats. They only had the opportunity to do this remarkable trip because of the fact that they were sons of Teddy Roosevelt. So ultimately, Nat, should we really feel sorry for them?
I don't think it's a matter of feeling sorry for them, but I think understanding what happened on this expedition, why it changed their minds about animals and about hunting expeditions in general, and how it impacted species is important. That's the real takeaway here. We don't necessarily have to have sympathy for the Roosevelts, but we can look at what this expedition gave us and the ways that it did change history. And I hope that in this book, I am really honest about who they were. I try to document both their gracious moments, and there are many of them. They became very close friends with Tai Jack Young. They were friends with him to the end of his life. They helped him become a scientist and helped funnel more money to him and bring him resources that he wouldn't have had otherwise. And then I also document, just terrible racist things they said along the trail as well. So I try to be as fair to their legacy as I can be while telling the story in its entirety.
And finally, what are the environmental lessons or the preservationist lessons about species and the environment that you think people should take from this book, The Beast in the Clouds, the Roosevelt brothers' deadly quest to find the mythical giant panda, which of course they did do? We'll save the moment when they found it. We want people to actually read the book. But what are the lessons today where the environment is as controversial and probably more important than it was back then?
Absolutely. You know, in the subtitle, I used the phrase deadly quest because I know that readers will immediately think I'm talking about a person dying, a human dying. And yes, someone does die on this trip. But what I'm really referring to, of course, are the animals. And I document what happened to them on this expedition in great detail. Even though it's not always easy to read or to experience, it gives us greater respect for what happened and why protecting these species are important, and especially why this particular corner of China is so diverse, why it's different than many other parts of the world, and what the lessons from what happened there mean on a larger scale.
Well, I, for one, will not look at pandas the same way, having had this conversation. Important new book, The Beast in the Clouds, the Roosevelt brothers' deadly quest. And it's not about their deadly quest, it's about the animals' deadly quest to find the mythical giant panda, by my guest, Nathalia Holt. Congratulations, Nat, on the book. And best of luck. I'm sure your next project will be equally interesting. You'll have to come back